They thought she would surrender. They believed overwhelming numbers and relentless pressure would break her spirit before the sun set. But what they didn't realize was that Selene was forged in silence and tempered by hardship, ready to face 50 enemies alone, fighting through 6 unforgiving hours of chaos and bloodshed. In a forgotten valley shadowed by craggy cliffs and whispered legends, a lone woman stood as the last line of defense, her heart beating with unyielding resolve. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The valley had always been a place of stories, tales whispered on the wind about warriors who fought against impossible odds, about secrets hidden beneath ancient stones and roots twisted by time. But today those stories were being rewritten, this time with Selene as the protagonist. From the moment the enemy forces spilled into the narrow ravine, the air thickened with the metallic scent of gunfire and dust. The sun dipped low behind jagged rocks, casting long shadows that danced with the echo of gunshots and distant cries. Every breath Selene took was measured, each heartbeat steady in a body that refused to betray weakness. The attackers believed their numbers were an unstoppable wave, a force of nature that could crush any resistance. They had come prepared, armed with heavy weapons and fierce intent. Their boots thundered against the rocky ground, their voices a cacophony of commands and taunts meant to unnerve any who would dare oppose them. But what they didn't know was that Selene had long ago embraced pain as her teacher and fear as her ally. She had learned the landscape like the back of her hand, mastering every twist of the valley and every hidden path. She was a shadow, a ghost in the rocks, a storm waiting to explode. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. As the first bullet shattered the stillness, Selene moved with the grace of a predator. She was the last hope for the small mountain village tucked deep within the valley's embrace, a village that had sheltered generations and now placed its faith in her alone. With every shot fired, every dodge and counterattack, she defied the impossible. 6 hours stretched ahead, filled with a brutal dance of survival and defiance, but the battle was more than physical. It was a test of spirit, a crucible that would separate the broken from the unbreakable. For Selene, surrender was a concept that had no place in her mind. She fought not just for herself, but for those who could no longer stand, the fallen friends whose memories burned like fire in her chest, the village that depended on her courage, and the legacy of warriors who had come before. She was their storm, fierce and relentless, and she would not be tamed. Every echo of gunfire, every flash of movement, told a story of endurance. As dusk turned to night, the valley itself seemed to hold its breath, watching the unyielding woman who refused to yield. Her silhouette became a symbol against the fading light, a testament to the truth that sometimes one person can change the course of history. Before the valley became a battleground soaked with gunfire and desperation, it was a sanctuary. A place carved out of rugged mountains and dense forests, where time seemed to move slower, and the outside world felt like a distant memory. The village nestled in the heart of this valley was small, almost forgotten, but it was home, and for Selene, it was everything. She had grown up surrounded by stories whispered by the elders, stories about the valley's ancient roots and the warriors who had once defended it against invaders far fiercer than today's enemies. These tales were not just myths to Selene, they were lessons etched into her very being. Her father, once a soldier in a distant war, had come back broken but resolute. He became the village's protector, a mentor to those who would follow in his footsteps. From him, Selene learned how to read the wind, how to disappear into the landscape, and how to endure when the world seemed to be crumbling around her. As a child, she often wandered the old paths carved by forgotten feet, exploring hidden caves and crumbling ruins. Those places held secrets, reminders of resilience and courage. Her father would watch her silently, knowing that the valley was not just a home but a crucible shaping the future defender of their people. The approaching threat was unlike anything the village had seen before. 50 enemies, organized, ruthless, and heavily armed, had set their sights on the valley. Their intent was clear: to wipe the sanctuary off the map, to crush any resistance and claim the land for themselves. The villagers knew the danger, and they prepared as best they could. But they also knew that the valley's narrow paths and rugged terrain gave them an advantage that only someone who truly understood the land could wield. Celine's training had been relentless. Her father pushed her to limits most would not dare approach. She learned to listen to the smallest sounds, to blend with the shadows, and to fight, not with brute force alone, but with cunning and precision. Her spirit hardened alongside her muscles, molded by the knowledge that one day she might have to stand alone against overwhelming odds. In the quiet moments before the battle, Celine often reflected on the weight of her heritage. The valley was more than soil and stone, it was the living memory of those who had fought before her. Every inch held stories of sacrifice and victory, whispered through the rustling leaves and echoed by the mountains. It was a sacred place, and she was its last guardian. The villagers gathered in small groups, faces pale but determined. Mothers clutched their children close, elders prayed silently, and young fighters sharpened their weapons with trembling hands. All eyes eventually turned to Celine, the one who had trained hardest, the one who had promised to protect them. That promise was more than words, it was a bond forged in the fires of loyalty and love. The valley's fate rested on her shoulders, and she accepted that burden with the fierce calm of a warrior born for this moment. The sun set slowly beyond the peaks, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch forever. Tomorrow, the battle would begin, and Celine would be ready. The first light of dawn barely filtered through the dense canopy as the enemy forces descended upon the valley. Their march was relentless, a tide of boots crushing twigs and loose stones, signaling the beginning of a storm that no one in the village could escape. The once peaceful morning air was quickly swallowed by the harsh sounds of war, clattering weapons, shouted commands, and the ominous thud of heavy footsteps pressing closer to the village's fragile heart. Celine crouched in the shadow of a jagged rock outcrop, her breath slow and controlled despite the pounding of her pulse. Every nerve was alert, her eyes scanning the movement of the enemy like a hawk circling its prey. She was alone, but the weight of generations seemed to rest on her shoulders, giving her strength. The training, the stories, the memories of those she fought for, all converged into a single purpose: to hold the line no matter the cost. The enemy thought they had the advantage. 50 of them, armed and confident, sure that their numbers would overwhelm any resistance, but they didn't know the valley, didn't know the traps hidden beneath the fallen leaves, or the secret paths that twisted like veins through the mountain. Celine moved with the stealth of a ghost, striking swiftly and vanishing before the enemy could respond. Her shots were deliberate, each one calculated to disrupt and confuse. The first clash erupted with ferocity. Gunfire cracked through the crisp morning air, echoing off the rocky walls. Men fell silently in the underbrush, unaware of the invisible hand picking them off one by one. Celine's every move was a dance with death, her heart steady even as adrenaline surged through her veins. She knew the enemy's confidence would waver if she could just hold on long enough. For 6 hours the battle raged, time lost meaning as the sun climbed, and then began to fall, shadows growing long once more. Celine's body ached from exertion, her muscles burned with exhaustion, yet she pressed on. The valley echoed with the chaos of war, shouts, gunfire, the occasional cry of pain, but through it all, she remained unbroken. Each enemy that approached felt the sting of her presence before they even saw her. They started to hesitate, to question the wisdom of attacking a lone woman so fiercely determined. The tide of battle was slowly shifting, the confidence of the invaders eroding under the weight of her resistance. As the hours dragged on, Celine found a rhythm, a grim, unyielding beat of survival. She fought with every fiber of her being, knowing that surrender would mean not only her death, but the destruction of everything she held dear. The valley was her home, her legacy, and she would defend it until her last breath. Amid the relentless chaos of battle, Celine carried a burden invisible to those who watched from afar, a weight that pressed heavily on her soul even as her body fought on. The silence between gunshots was filled with memories, faces of friends and loved ones lost to past conflicts, their absence a quiet echo driving her forward. She fought not just for herself or the village, but for the legacy of those who could no longer stand beside her, their hopes and sacrifices entwined with her every heartbeat. The valley, scarred by the thunder of combat, seemed to hold its breath. The wind whispered through the pines and over jagged cliffs, carrying with it the ghosts of battles long past. Celine understood the valley's language, the sorrow, the strength, the unspoken resolve that had built her home. It was more than a backdrop to war, it was a living witness to defiance. Her movements, precise and purposeful, hid the storm raging within. Each time she ducked behind a rock or slid along the forest floor, the weight of loss settled on her chest like a stone, but instead of breaking her, it fueled her. The silence between the shouts was louder than any roar, and it spoke of a pain transformed into power. At times the battle paused, moments so brief they felt like eternity, where Celine could hear her own ragged breaths and the pounding of her heart, beating in rhythm with the valley itself. These moments were prayers, vows renewed silently beneath the open sky. She was not alone, she carried the strength of those who came before her, and the hopes of those who would follow. Her eyes, sharp and steady, scanned the horizon constantly, searching for signs of weakness in the enemy ranks. The invaders, once brash and confident, now moved with caution, their voices hushed and their steps faltering. The weight of silence, of loss, and of unyielding will had shifted the tide. As dusk began to bleed into night, Celine stood resolute. Her spirit, tempered by grief and hardened by resolve, was a beacon in the growing darkness. She was more than a fighter, she was the embodiment of a legacy no enemy could erase. Hours of relentless combat had left the valley stained with sweat, blood, and the heavy scent of gunpowder. Celine's limbs throbbed with exhaustion, and her lungs burned with every ragged breath, but within her, an unyielding fire continued to blaze, refusing to be extinguished by fatigue or fear. As the sun sank lower, painting the horizon in bruised purples and fiery reds, something began to shift, a subtle change in the rhythm of battle that only the keenest eyes could perceive. The enemy, once confident and organized, was beginning to falter. Their formations wavered, their movements less assured. Celine had become a ghost in the valley, unseen, unpredictable, and lethal. Her intimate knowledge of the terrain turned into a deadly advantage. Hidden traps she had painstakingly prepared in days past snapped shut around careless foes. Narrow ravines became kill zones where she could pick off enemies one by one without exposing herself to overwhelming fire. It was a chess game played with bullets and blood, and Celine was slowly gaining the upper hand. She remembered her father's lessons vividly, how the valley itself could be a weapon if you understood its language. Using the natural cover of twisted roots and crumbling stone ledges, she orchestrated ambushes that shattered enemy morale. The invaders' shouts of frustration echoed louder than their gunfire. The tide was turning. One by one, enemy lines began to break. Groups scattered into chaos, their cohesion unraveling as panic set in. Celine moved swiftly, striking with precision and retreating before they could regroup. The 6 hours of fighting stretched on, but her spirit remained ironclad. With every enemy felled, the village's hope was rekindled. Stories would later speak of the woman who fought like a tempest, whose courage turned the valley from a tomb into a fortress. Her silhouette, bathed in the dying light, was a symbol of unbreakable will. As night finally claimed the sky, Celine allowed herself a brief moment to breathe, to honor those who had fallen, and to steel herself for whatever came next. The battle was far from over, but the turning tide was undeniable. The storm she had become was no longer just resisting, it was pushing back with the full force of a tempest unleashed. As darkness settled over the valley, a fragile silence replaced the cacophony of battle. The enemy forces, though battered and disorganized, were far from defeated. They regrouped beneath the cloak of night, their murmurs heavy with frustration and a growing fear. Celine, too, felt the weight of the prolonged conflict pressing down on her spirit. Every muscle ached, every breath was a reminder of how tenuous her survival was. Yet within that exhaustion flickered a flame that refused to be snuffed out. The shadows seemed to stretch longer here, twisted by the flickering light of distant fires and the stars above. Celine moved cautiously, knowing that the night could hide new dangers. She understood that the enemy would use darkness to their advantage, seeking to encircle her, to wear her down with surprise attacks and stealthy maneuvers. But the valley was her ally, its silence a familiar song she had learned to listen to since childhood. Doubt, the enemy's silent weapon, crept into her mind. What if the numbers were too great? What if her strength faltered at the worst moment? These thoughts whispered like ghosts, testing the resolve she had built over years of training and hardship. But each time the shadows tried to claim her courage, she pushed back harder. The memories of those who depended on her, the faces of friends lost, and the very ground beneath her feet steeled her against despair. Throughout the night, Celine patrolled the perimeter, every sense heightened. Her footsteps were light, blending with the rustling leaves and distant calls of nocturnal creatures. She set traps and signals, preparing for the inevitable renewed assault at dawn. The valley, once serene, now hummed with tension and anticipation. In those quiet hours, Celine's mind was a battlefield as much as the ravine. She wrestled with the exhaustion and fear that tried to erode her spirit, reminding herself that resilience was not the absence of doubt but the triumph over it. The first light of morning would bring new challenges, but she would face them with the same unyielding will that had carried her through the day. The storm within her was far from spent, it was gathering strength in the shadows. The horizon began to lighten, a thin band of pale gold piercing the veil of night. Dawn was breaking over the valley, bringing with it both hope and the promise of renewed conflict. Celine's eyes, weary but sharp, scanned the landscape as the first rays of sunlight warmed the cold earth. The enemy had spent the night regrouping, and she knew the coming hours would test every ounce of her resolve once again. Though fatigue gnawed at her bones, Celine felt a surge of determination. The darkness had been her cover and her enemy. Now the light would reveal truths that could turn the tide. She moved swiftly through the familiar terrain, using every shadow and stone to her advantage. The valley, etched deep into her memory, was a silent partner in the struggle, guiding her footsteps with quiet certainty. The enemy forces, weakened but not broken, emerged cautiously from their makeshift camps. Their confidence had been shaken, but their numbers still posed a significant threat. Yet Celine sensed a growing hesitation in their ranks, the woman they had underestimated, the single figure who had defied their expectations had become a legend in her own right. Whispers of her relentless resistance spread like wildfire, sowing seeds of doubt among the attackers. Celine's mind was sharp, every decision deliberate. She set traps with renewed vigor, laying snares and pitfalls in the narrow paths the enemy was sure to take. Her senses were tuned to the slightest movement, the faintest sound, a snapped twig, a shifting shadow. The battle was no longer just about survival, it was about strategy, about turning fear into a weapon. As the sun climbed higher, the first skirmishes of the new day erupted. Gunfire shattered the morning calm and the valley once again echoed with the cries of combat. Celine moved with a predator's grace, striking swiftly and disappearing before the enemy could respond. Her endurance was tested as the fight dragged on, but her spirit remained unbroken. Each moment of victory was hard-won, each breath a reminder of the stakes at hand. The valley was more than a battleground, it was a symbol of defiance, and Celine was its fiercest guardian. The dawn had broken, but the storm within her was far from over. The morning's light exposed cracks in the enemy's facade. Where once they had advanced with brutal certainty, now their ranks hesitated, whispers of fear replacing confident shouts. Celine's relentless defense had shaken their resolve, turning what was meant to be a swift conquest into a grinding, desperate battle of attrition. The valley, with its rugged terrain and steep cliffs, was no longer just a place to be taken, it was a fortress shaped by her determination. The invaders' commanders exchanged grim looks, their plan to overwhelm the valley's defenders had faltered, and with each passing hour, the cost in lives mounted.
The realization that one woman could hold an entire force at bay was unsettling, to say the least. Fear crept into their ranks like a silent poison, eroding discipline and sowing mistrust. Soldiers questioned orders, and small pockets of retreat began to appear under the cover of uneven terrain. Celine, sensing the shifting tide, pressed her advantage. Her attacks became more daring, her movements fluid and unpredictable. She was a shadow slipping through the chaos, appearing where least expected, striking with precision, and vanishing before retaliation. Every trap she had set ensnared another enemy, and the ground was littered with the remnants of their failed attempts to break her line, but the battle was far from over. The enemy was desperate now, willing to risk everything to end her resistance. Celine knew that their desperation would make them unpredictable and dangerous. The hours ahead would demand everything she had and more. Despite the mounting fatigue, Celine's spirit burned fiercely. She was no longer fighting just for survival, but to prove that even in the face of overwhelming odds, courage and resolve could carve out victory. The valley had become a crucible, and she its unyielding storm. The battle had stretched beyond the limits of endurance, and Celine found herself standing in the very heart of the storm. Her body was bruised and battered, each movement a sharp reminder of the relentless struggle she had endured for hours. Yet in the depths of exhaustion, a fierce fire burned within her, a refusal to yield, to break, or to surrender. Around her the valley was a chaotic symphony of destruction. Smoke curled into the sky, mingling with the rising sun, casting a hazy glow over the battlefield. The once pristine forest floor was scarred with craters, trampled earth, and the silent forms of fallen soldiers. The cries of the wounded and the desperate orders of the enemy commanders filled the air, but Celine's focus was unshakable. She moved with a deadly grace, her every step calculated, every breath controlled. The enemies, still numerous but increasingly desperate, launched wave after wave of attacks, hoping to overwhelm her defenses through sheer force. But Celine was a master of endurance, turning fatigue into strength and pain into determination. Her mind replayed the lessons of her youth, the training, the stories of the valley's defenders past, and the steady presence of her father's voice urging her onward. She remembered the faces of those she fought for, the village that depended on her, and the legacy she carried. These memories were her armor, a shield stronger than any bulletproof vest. In the midst of the storm, Celine's will became an unbreakable force, a tempest that no enemy could calm. The hours ticked by like an eternity, but she stood tall, fighting not just against the enemy, but against the darkness that sought to claim her spirit. Though her body screamed for rest, her heart beat with unwavering resolve. The storm raged on, but within its eyes stood a woman who refused to be broken. As exhaustion threatened to overtake her, Celine discovered strength in an unexpected form: the valley itself. The familiar terrain, once just a backdrop for the battle, became an unseen ally that whispered secrets only she could hear. Every ridge, every hidden crevice, every rustling leaf seemed to guide her movements, providing cover and openings where none seemed possible. Her connection to the land was more than knowledge, it was a bond forged through years of living in harmony with the valley's rhythms. She had trained her body and mind to flow with the landscape, turning natural obstacles into strategic advantages. Now, in the heat of battle, that bond became her greatest weapon. Enemy soldiers found themselves caught in snares, hidden beneath fallen branches, slipping into pits cleverly concealed by loose earth and leaves. Celine moved silently, striking swiftly from shadows cast by ancient trees and rocky outcrops. She seemed everywhere and nowhere, a force that the enemy could neither see nor predict. Despite the growing darkness and her aching body, Celine's spirit remained fiercely alive. The valley's whispers bolstered her courage, reminding her that she was part of something greater, a legacy of defenders who had faced impossible odds and triumphed. This connection gave her the clarity and strength to anticipate enemy moves, turning their own strategies against them. As the battle raged into its final hours, the enemy's frustration grew, their plans unraveled, their morale crumbled, and their resolve faltered under the weight of an unseen force that fought alongside Celine. She was no longer just a solitary warrior, she was the valley's wrath incarnate. The sun dipped below the horizon, and the final phase of the battle was about to begin. Celine's unyielding storm was gathering its last fierce winds, ready to sweep away those who dared challenge it.
The night was thick with tension, each moment charged with the electricity of an imminent finale. Celine's body, battered and worn, had become a testament to endurance, a living symbol of resilience forged through hours of relentless conflict. Celine's with takers, the six so much charge torch 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 She knew the enemy would not relent, their desperation was as fierce as her determination. This was the moment where everything hung in the balance. Positioned atop a jagged ridge overlooking the valley floor, Celine prepared for the last wave. The enemy had regrouped, their remaining forces consolidated into a final furious assault. They sought to crush the defiance she embodied and claim the valley through sheer force. But she was ready. Every scar on her body told the story of battles survived, every breath was a silent vow to protect what mattered most. The first assault crashed against her defenses like a tidal wave, a chaotic surge of gunfire and shouts. Celine met it head-on, her movements a blur of precision and power. She fired, dodged, and countered with unyielding ferocity. Her mind was clear, her instincts honed to perfection by years of training and the crucible of this very fight. Despite the odds, Celine held firm. The enemy's advance faltered under the weight of her relentless resistance. The valley seemed to roar with her spirit, the land itself rising in defense of its last guardian. Time stretched and twisted in the fury of battle, each second a lifetime of struggle and hope. As the night deepened, Celine's focus never wavered. She became a whirlwind of calculated strikes, each one breaking the enemy's momentum, each breath a step closer to victory. The storm she was had reached its peak, fierce, unyielding, and unstoppable. When dawn finally broke, it revealed a valley scarred but unbroken, a testament to the woman who had fought not just against 50 enemies, but against the very limits of human endurance and spirit. The first light of dawn spilled gently over the battered valley, casting long shadows over the scarred earth and fallen foes. The cacophony of battle had faded into an eerie silence broken only by the distant cries of the wounded and the whisper of the wind through shattered trees. Celine stood alone amid the ruins, her breath ragged but steady, the storm inside her finally beginning to subside. Victory had come at a heavy cost. The valley, once vibrant and alive, bore the marks of relentless conflict, uprooted trees, shattered rocks, and the haunting silence of loss. Celine's body was bruised and battered, every movement a reminder of the fierce fight she had endured. Yet beneath the physical toll, an unshakable sense of purpose remained. She had stood against impossible odds, and prevailed. As the survivors of the village emerged from their hiding places, their eyes filled with awe and gratitude. To them Celine was more than a fighter, she was a symbol of hope, a living legend who had turned the tide of fate. Their whispered stories of her bravery would ripple through generations, a testament to the power of resilience and courage. But Celine's journey was far from over. The enemy might have been repelled, but the scars they left ran deep, and the threats beyond the valley's borders still loomed. She knew the battle had changed her, hardening her spirit and sharpening her resolve. The valley had been defended, but the war was not yet won. In the quiet aftermath, Celine took a moment to honor those who had fallen, the friends, the mentors, the innocents caught in the crossfire. Their memories would fuel her resolve, a silent promise that their sacrifices would never be forgotten. The valley was scarred, yes, but its heart still beat strong, guarded by a woman who had become its unyielding storm. As the sun rose higher, Celine looked toward the horizon, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. Her fight was not just for survival, but for the legacy she was determined to protect. The storm had passed, but its fury would echo forever. Even as the valley began to heal, Celine knew that the danger was far from over. The battle against 50 enemies was only the surface of a deeper, darker threat. Shadows lingered beyond the mountains, unseen forces moving with silent intent, waiting for the right moment to strike again. The enemy she had faced was but a fragment of a greater plan, a puzzle with pieces hidden in the mist of secrecy. The villagers whispered of spies and traitors, of secrets sold for coin and promises broken in the dead of night. Celine understood that true victory required more than strength and courage. It demanded vigilance, cunning, and an unrelenting watchfulness. The valley's walls could not protect them from enemies who moved unseen, whose weapons were not only bullets but deceit and betrayal. In the days following the battle, Celine became both warrior and sentinel. She trained new defenders, strengthened alliances, and scoured the surrounding forests for signs of infiltration. Her mind sharpened like a blade, honed by the knowledge that survival depended on anticipating the enemy's next move. This unseen enemy was a test unlike any before, a battle fought in shadows, where trust was fragile and every step could lead to ruin. Celine embraced the challenge, knowing that the fight for the valley's future would require more than just strength. It would require wisdom and unbreakable resolve. As night fell over the recovering valley, Celine stood watchful, eyes scanning the darkness. The storm had not passed, it had only changed form. The valley, once threatened with destruction, now stood resilient, a testament to the indomitable spirit of its people and the fierce defender who had saved them. Celine's battle had become legend, whispered in hushed tones around campfires, and passed down through generations. But beyond the stories and songs, her true legacy was written in the lives she touched and the strength she inspired. She was no longer just a warrior, she was a symbol of hope, courage, and unyielding determination. The scars she bore were badges of honor, reminders of the sacrifices made to protect what was sacred. Celine dedicated herself to rebuilding the valley, nurturing its people, and preparing the next generation to face whatever storms the future might bring. Her eyes often drifted to the horizon, where the sun rose and set over the mountains she called home. The valley had been her battleground, her sanctuary, and her family. She vowed to guard it always, knowing that the true fight was not only against enemies with guns, but against the tides of despair and fear that could erode even the strongest hearts. The scars left by the recent battle were visible: uprooted trees, shattered homes, and fields scorched by fire, but they were also marks of survival and endurance. The villagers worked tirelessly to heal the land, planting seeds of renewal while their hearts held the memory of loss. Children listened wide-eyed to Celine's stories, learning about bravery, sacrifice, and the unbreakable spirit that had saved them all. At night Celine would stand beneath the star-strewn sky, feeling the weight of her responsibility but also the warmth of hope that radiated from her people. She understood that her fight had sparked a flame, a beacon that would light the way through darkness for years to come. The legacy she was building was not just about strength in battle, but about the courage to rebuild, to face hardship with unyielding resolve, and to protect the valley's spirit at all costs. Celine knew that storms would come again, but she was ready. Her story, and the story of the valley, would endure as long as the mountains stood. And so the storm within her became a lasting force, not one of destruction, but of resilience, hope, and the fierce love that binds a community together through the darkest of times. Though the valley had been defended, and its people were rebuilding, Celine knew that the battle was far from over. The scars of war ran deeper than visible wounds, and beyond the mountains loomed new dangers, darker and more insidious than the last enemy. Whispers of an approaching force, more organized, more ruthless, began to reach her ears, carried by travelers and scouts who spoke in hushed tones. This new threat was not just a band of soldiers seeking land, It was a calculated power with far-reaching ambitions, one that thrived on chaos and sought to exploit the valley's strategic position. Celine's experience had taught her to trust the signs, the nervous glances of villagers, strange movements in the forests, and the sudden disappearance of scouts sent to gather information. Her role evolved once more, from defender to leader and strategist. She began forging alliances with neighboring villages, sharing intelligence, and preparing the valley for the long road ahead. Training intensified. Every able-bodied person was taught not just how to wield a weapon, but how to read the land, how to listen to the wind, and how to fight not just with strength, but with cunning. Celine held council meetings beneath ancient oaks, her voice steady and commanding as she laid out plans and rallied spirits. The villagers looked to her not just for protection, but for hope, and she carried their trust like a sacred burden. The valley had survived one storm, but the horizon now threatened with darker clouds. Despite the mounting pressure, Celine found moments of quiet strength in the valley's enduring beauty, the rustle of leaves in the wind, the steady flow of the river, and the resilience of life returning to scarred earth. These reminders of life's persistence fortified her resolve. The battle for the valley was shifting from desperate survival to calculated resistance. Celine prepared her people for what was coming, knowing that the true test of their spirit was just beginning. The storm she had once faced alone was now a gathering tempest, and together with her community, she would meet it head-on. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the battlefield, as Celine's breathing grew more labored. 5 hours had passed since the siege began, and her body bore the weight of every clash, every parry, every desperate maneuver that had kept her alive. Blood seeped through makeshift bandages on her left arm, and a deep gash along her ribs sent waves of pain with each breath. 23 enemies lay scattered around the courtyard, some motionless, others groaning in pain. The remaining 27 had regrouped near the main gate, their confidence shaken but not broken. Celine could see them whispering among themselves, pointing at her defensive position behind an overturned wagon. "She's weakening," one of them called out, his voice carrying across the stone courtyard. "Look at how she favors her left side. We can end this now." Celine gritted her teeth, fighting the urge to respond, let them think what they wanted. She had learned long ago that underestimation was often a warrior's greatest ally. She adjusted her grip on her sword, feeling the familiar weight that had become an extension of her will. The fortress she defended wasn't just stone and mortar, it was the last sanctuary for dozens of civilians who had fled the approaching army. Behind the thick wooden doors of the inner keep, families huddled together, their fate resting entirely on her ability to hold this position. She had promised them safety, and Celine had never broken a promise that mattered. A memory flickered through her exhausted mind, her mentor's words from youth. "A true warrior doesn't fight for glory or gold," the old woman had said, her scarred hands demonstrating proper sword technique. "She fights for what cannot be replaced, for the innocent, for justice, for the future itself." The enemy commander, a burly man with intricate tattoos covering his arms, stepped forward. "Enough of this madness, you've proven your skill, woman. Join us, and we'll spare not just your life, but the lives of those cowering behind you. Refuse, and when we finally break through, no mercy will be shown." Celine rose from her defensive crouch, her sword catching the dying light. Despite her injuries, she stood tall, her voice carrying across the courtyard with unwavering resolve. "I've heard those words before from men who thought strength meant crushing the weak. You want to reach those people, you'll have to go through me first." The commander's face darkened. "So be it, you've chosen death." But as Celine prepared for the next wave, something unexpected happened. From the battlements above, a young voice rang out, clear and defiant. "For Celine, for our protector." Soon more voices joined in, then dozens more. The civilians she was protecting had climbed to the windows and walls, not to fight, but to bear witness. Their chant grew stronger. "For Celine, for our protector." The sound washed over her like a healing balm, filling her with renewed strength. These people believed in her, trusted her with their lives. Their faith was worth more than any armor,
sharper than any blade. Celine raised her sword toward the sky, acknowledging their support, then pointed it directly at the enemy commander. The message was clear: she would not yield, could not yield, would not even consider yielding while innocent lives hung in the balance. The remaining enemies exchanged uncertain glances. They had expected to face a lone, desperate warrior. Instead, they found themselves confronting someone who fought with the strength of an entire community behind her. Someone who had transformed from a single defender into a symbol of hope itself. As the 6th hour of battle approached, Celine knew the hardest fights still lay ahead. But she also knew something her enemies didn't. She was no longer fighting alone. The 6th hour arrived with a vengeance. Celine's enemies, now desperate to finish what they had started, launched their most coordinated assault yet. They came at her from 3 directions, 10 from the left, 10 from the right, and 7 straight ahead, leaving no room for retreat or clever maneuvering. Celine's muscles screamed in protest as she threw herself into the melee. Her sword work had evolved throughout the day from precise technique to pure survival instinct. Every movement was economical, born from necessity rather than training manuals. She ducked under a warhammer's devastating swing, her blade finding the wielder's exposed thigh in the same motion. Spinning away from that attack, she found herself face to face with twin brothers who fought in perfect synchronization. Their matching scars and identical fighting stances told the story of warriors who had battled side by side for years. They pressed their advantage, forcing Celine to give ground for the first time all day. The crowd above had grown silent, watching with held breath as their defenders struggled against impossible odds. Children pressed their faces against windows while parents pulled them back, unable to look away from the desperate struggle below. Celine's left arm had gone almost numb from blood loss, forcing her to adapt her fighting style once again. She began using the environment more aggressively, kicking loose stones into her attackers' faces, using broken weapons as projectiles, even grabbing handfuls of dust to blind opponents at crucial moments. One of the twins overextended during a particularly aggressive thrust, and Celine seized the opening. Her blade found the gap between his chest plates, and he crumpled with a gasp of surprise. His brother's anguished cry echoed off the fortress walls as he redoubled his attacks, fury replacing technique. But rage made fighters predictable. Celine waited for the inevitable overhead strike, stepped aside at the last second, and her counter-strike ended the second twin's quest for vengeance. The remaining attackers hesitated, their confidence further shaken. They had begun this siege, expecting to overwhelm a single defender through sheer numbers. Instead, they found themselves reduced by more than half, facing a warrior who seemed to grow more dangerous as the day wore on. Celine used their hesitation to catch her breath, pressing her back against the overturned wagon that had become her anchor point. Her vision wavered slightly from exhaustion and blood loss, but her grip on her sword remained steady. She had fought too hard and too long to falter now. From the corner of her eye, she spotted movement on the western wall. Hope flared in her chest as she recognized the banners approaching in the distance. Reinforcements were finally arriving. But they were still at least an hour away, maybe more. She needed to hold out just a little longer. The enemy commander had noticed the approaching banners too. His face contorted with rage as he realized his window for victory was rapidly closing. "Kill her now," he roared. "All of you, together. End this before those reinforcements arrive." The remaining fighters, now reduced to 18, formed a semicircle around Celine's position. She could see the desperation in their eyes, the growing realization that they had underestimated not just her skill, but her resolve. They needed to finish this quickly, or they would find themselves trapped between Celine's defenses and the approaching relief force. Celine straightened her shoulders and raised her weapon. Her body ached, her left arm hung nearly useless at her side, and dried blood crusted half her face. But her eyes burned with the same fierce determination that had carried her through the previous 5 hours. "Come then," she called out, her voice hoarse bull. The semicircle of remaining attackers closed in with grim determination. 18 against 1 odds that would have been laughable at the day's beginning now felt like Celine's greatest challenge yet. Her body had moved beyond pain into a strange realm where adrenaline and pure will kept her functioning despite injuries that should have ended the fight hours ago. The enemy commander stepped forward, his massive sword gleaming despite the blood that stained its edge. "You've cost me too many good fighters, woman. I'll finish you myself." But Celine had learned something crucial during her 6 hours of combat. Individual skill mattered less than understanding your opponent's weaknesses. As the commander charged with predictable fury, she noted his heavy armor, his reliance on brute strength, the way his anger made his attacks powerful but telegraphed. She waited until the last possible moment before rolling aside, letting his momentum carry him into the stone wall behind her. The impact rang out like a bell, and she saw him stagger, momentarily stunned. Her sword found a gap at his shoulder joint, and he roared in pain and rage. The other 17 fighters rushed her then, abandoning coordination for desperation. Celine found herself in the purest form of combat, instinct against instinct, will against will. She moved like water around their attacks, her blade seeming to appear where vigor was needed most. A spear thrust aimed at her heart instead caught only air as she twisted away. Her counter-attack opened the spear wielder's wrist, and his weapon clattered to the ground. An axe swung where her head had been a heartbeat before, but she had already dropped to one knee, her upward strike catching the axeman under his ribs. The watching civilians above had begun to understand they were witnessing something extraordinary. This wasn't just a fight for survival, it was a masterclass in courage itself. Children who had been terrified hours ago now watched with wide eyes, seeing firsthand what it meant to never give up. Celine's movements had become almost dance-like, each step flowing into the next with deadly precision. She used every lesson learned during the day, every adaptation forced by exhaustion or injury. When her left arm couldn't parry, she dodged. When her legs grew unsteady, she used the wall for support. When her vision blurred, she relied on sound and instinct. One by one, her attackers fell or fled. Some limped away, no longer willing to face this seemingly supernatural defender. Others lay groaning on the blood-stained stones, their fighting days ended. The few who remained standing looked at each other with growing unease. The enemy commander, blood streaming from his shoulder wound, backed toward the gate. His earlier confidence had evaporated completely. "This isn't possible," he muttered. "One person can't. No one fights like this." Celine stepped forward, her sword steady, despite everything she had endured. "You're right," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the courtyard. "One person couldn't do this, but I'm not fighting alone. I never was." She gestured toward the walls above, where dozens of faces looked down at her with expressions of awe and gratitude. "Every person up there, every life you threatened, every family you would have destroyed, they're all fighting. Their hope is my strength, their trust is my armor." The commander's remaining followers, now reduced to just 7, began backing away. They had come here expecting an easy victory over a desperate defender. Instead they found themselves facing something they had never encountered, a warrior who drew strength, not from hatred or bloodlust, but from love and protection. One by one, they turned and ran. The commander stood alone for a moment, his face a mask of disbelief and defeat. Then he too turned and fled, leaving behind nearly half his force scattered across Celine's courtyard. Celine watched them disappear through the gates, then slowly sank to her knees. The battle was over. She had won, not just survived, but truly won. The approaching reinforcements would find a fortress still standing, its people safe, its defender bloodied but unbroken. As cheers erupted from the walls above, Celine finally allowed herself to smile.
As the dust settled and the last of her enemies disappeared into the distance, Celine remained on her knees in the blood-stained courtyard. The cheers from above seemed to come from another world, muffled by the strange emptiness that follows an impossible victory. She had fought 50 enemies for 6 hours and won, but victory, she was learning, carried its own weight. Her sword, which had felt like an extension of her soul throughout the battle, now seemed impossibly heavy. She let it fall to the stones beside her, the metallic ring echoing off the fortress walls. Her hands, steady throughout hours of combat, now shook uncontrollably as the adrenaline finally began to ebb. The first person to reach her was an elderly woman named Marta, whose grandchildren had been among those sheltering in the keep. The old woman's weathered hands were gentle as she examined Celine's wounds, clucking her tongue at the damage that should have killed any normal fighter hours ago. "Child," Marta whispered, tears streaming down her face, "what you've done today, there are no words." Other civilians began emerging from the fortress, moving cautiously at first, then rushing forward as they realized the danger had truly passed. Children who had watched from the windows now crowded around Celine, their eyes wide with the kind of awe usually reserved for legends come to life. But Celine found herself struggling with emotions she hadn't expected. The faces of the men she had killed flashed through her mind, not monsters, but people who had families, dreams, fears of their own. She had done what was necessary, what was right, but that didn't erase the weight of taking so many lives. "The reinforcements," she managed to say, her voice barely above a whisper. "Are they?" "Still an hour away," replied Thomas, the fortress's senior guard, who had been injured early in the siege. "You held them off, Celine. You saved us all." As the civilians worked to bandage her wounds and help her to her feet, Celine caught sight of herself in a piece of polished metal. The reflection showed a figure she barely recognized, hair matted with blood and sweat, face marked by cuts and bruises, clothes torn and stained. But her eyes, those same determined eyes that had stared down 50 attackers, still burned with the inner fire that had carried her through the impossible day. A young girl, perhaps 8 years old, tugged at Celine's tattered sleeve. "Are you really human?" the child asked with innocent curiosity. "Mama said no human could fight like that." Celine knelt down, ignoring the pain that shot through her battered body, and looked the girl in the eyes. "I'm as human as you are, little one. But sometimes, when people we love are in danger, we find strength we never knew we had." The girl nodded solemnly, as if this explanation made perfect sense to her young mind. "Will you teach me to fight like that someday?" "I hope," Celine said softly, "that you'll never need to learn." As the sun began to set, painting the battlefield in shades of gold and crimson, Celine finally allowed herself to truly feel the magnitude of what she had accomplished. 50 enemies had come to destroy everything these people held dear, and now those same people were safe because she had refused to surrender. But as she looked around at the carnage, at the broken weapons and blood-stained stones, she understood that this victory had changed her forever. She was no longer just a warrior, she had become something else entirely. A symbol, a legend, a reminder that sometimes, when everything seems lost, one person's refusal to give up can change the course of history itself. The reinforcements would arrive soon, and with them would come questions, celebrations, and attempts to make sense of what had happened here. But for now, in the growing twilight, Celine simply sat among the people she had saved, and allowed herself to rest. She had kept her promise, everyone was safe, that was all that mattered. As the dust settled and the last of her enemies disappeared into the distance, Celine remained on her knees in the blood-stained courtyard. The cheers from above seemed to come from another world, muffled by the strange emptiness that follows an impossible victory. She had fought 50 enemies for 6 hours and won, but victory, she was learning, carried its own weight. Her sword, which had felt like an extension of her soul throughout the battle, now seemed impossibly heavy. She let it fall to the stones beside her, the metallic ring echoing off the fortress walls. Her hands, steady throughout hours of combat, now shook uncontrollably as the adrenaline finally began to ebb. The first person to reach her was an elderly woman named Marta, whose grandchildren had been among those sheltering in the keep. The old woman's weathered hands were gentle as she examined Celine's wounds, clucking her tongue at the damage that should have killed any normal fighter hours ago. "Child," Marta whispered, tears streaming down her face, "what you've done today. There are no words." Other civilians began emerging from the fortress, moving cautiously at first, then rushing forward as they realized the danger had truly passed. Children who had watched from the windows now crowded around Celine, their eyes wide with the kind of awe usually reserved for legends come to life. But Celine found herself struggling with emotions she hadn't expected. The faces of the men she had killed flashed through her mind, not monsters, but people who had families, dreams, fears of their own. She had done what was necessary, what was right, but that didn't erase the weight of taking so many lives. The reinforcements, she managed to say, her voice barely above a whisper. Are they? Still an hour away, replied Thomas, the fortress's senior guard who had been injured early in the siege. You held them off, Celine, you saved us all. As the civilians worked to bandage her wounds and help her to her feet, Celine caught sight of herself in a piece of polished metal. The reflection showed a figure she barely recognized, hair matted with blood and sweat, face marked by cuts and bruises, clothes torn and stained. But her eyes, those same determined eyes that had stared down 50 attackers, still burned with the inner fire that had carried her through the impossible day. A young girl, perhaps 8 years old, tugged at Celine's tattered sleeve. Are you really human? The child asked with innocent curiosity. Mama said no human could fight like that. Celine knelt down, ignoring the pain that shot through her battered body, and looked the girl in the eye. I'm as human as you are, little one. But sometimes, when people we love are in danger, we find strength we never knew we had. The girl nodded solemnly, as if this explanation made perfect sense to her young mind. Will you teach me to fight like that someday? I hope, Celine said softly, that you'll never need to learn. As the sun began to set, painting the battlefield in shades of gold and crimson, Celine finally allowed herself to truly feel the magnitude of what she had accomplished. 50 enemies had come to destroy everything these people held dear, and now those same people were safe because she had refused to surrender. But as she looked around at the carnage, at the broken weapons and blood-stained stones, she understood that this victory had changed her forever. She was no longer just a warrior, she had become something else entirely. A symbol, a legend, a reminder that sometimes, when everything seems lost, one person's refusal to give up can change the course of history itself. The reinforcements would arrive soon, and with them would come questions, celebrations, and attempts to make sense of what had happened here. But for now, in the growing twilight, Celine simply sat among the people she had saved and allowed herself to rest. She had kept her promise, everyone was safe. That was all that mattered. The battlefield had fallen strangely quiet. Ash drifted through the ruins like forgotten snow, and the charred scent of oil and blood clung to the air like an accusation. Celine crouched behind the jagged remains of a stone pillar, her breathing steady despite the pain radiating through her ribs. Her blade, once pristine, now chipped and darkened, rested against her thigh. She watched, unmoving, as 4 soldiers crept across the broken courtyard, searching for her in the aftermath of a skirmish she had ended moments before. Each movement was deliberate. Each heartbeat felt like the toll of a distant war drum. They thought she had vanished into the smoke, that she had run out of strength, out of will. They were wrong. The silence wasn't safety, it was strategy, the calm before the next storm. Celine shifted her weight slightly, avoiding a loose stone that would betray her position. Her body screamed in protest, wounds stitched crudely during stolen minutes, bruises blossoming beneath her armor, muscles aching from 6 hours of brutal engagement, but she didn't flinch. Pain was irrelevant now. Fatigue had become a companion, a voice she silenced with purpose. She studied the 4 men. 2 carried halberds, 1 bore a short axe, and the last had a crossbow slung over his back. None of them moved like elites. Their confidence came from numbers, not skill. And that, she could use. One of the halberd wielders stepped too close to the wreckage, a flick of her hand. Steel whispered through air. The throwing knife struck true, buried itself beneath the man's eye before he could register surprise. He dropped wordlessly, a puppet whose strings had been cut. The other 3 froze. Celine didn't. She exploded from cover with the precision of a hawk diving for prey. Her legs, though heavy with exhaustion, pushed her into a sprint. The crossbowman scrambled for his weapon, but his fingers fumbled under pressure. Too slow, she struck first. A rising slash opened his chest before he could pull the trigger. Blood sprayed the wall behind him, mixing with soot and rain. The axeman roared, swinging wide in a rage-fueled arc. Selene ducked under it, feeling the wind of the blade skim over her shoulder. She pivoted, planting her foot, and slammed the hilt of her sword into his throat. He collapsed, gagging, clawing at the crushed windpipe. Only one remained. The final halberdier backed away, eyes wide, weapon trembling in his grip. He had seen what she did to his comrades. He had heard the stories, and now, face to face with the myth, he understood the truth. She wasn't a ghost, she was worse. Selene advanced slow and deliberate. "You can leave," she said coldly. "Run, if you think you'll make it." He turned, he ran. She didn't stop him, not this time. Let him carry the fear back to the others. Let her legend spread. Selene exhaled slowly, feeling the tremor in her limbs. Her heart thundered against her ribs, not from fear, from restraint. She knew how close she was to the edge, how easy it would be to give in to the violence completely, to lose herself in the chaos. But she couldn't afford that. Not yet. She slid back into the shadows, moving through the rubble of what had once been the eastern watchtower. Stones were cracked and scorched, and blackened spears jutted out of the ground like skeletal fingers. A small cache of broken weapons lay near the crumbling stairs, spoils from earlier kills. She crouched, sifting through them for anything useful. A half-full canteen. She drank, rationing every drop. A curved dagger, still sharp. She slipped it into her boot, a length of wire. Selene paused, fingers tightening around the wire. Her mind spun with possibilities. Traps, distractions, snares. Good. She had time to set something, because they would be back. Not just 4, next time it would be 10, maybe more. They knew she was still alive now, and that scared them. As it should. The courtyard beyond the tower opened into what had once been a temple square. Selene crept to the edge of the broken archway and scanned the terrain. Flickering torchlight told her they were regrouping to the west. Voices murmured, too far to make out words, but the tone was unmistakable. Tension, disbelief, fear. She marked their position, then she vanished into the narrow alleys between the ruins. Her mind raced even as her body screamed for rest. She calculated every path, every ambush point, every possible route they could take. She couldn't face them head-on anymore. Not all at once. Her injuries were piling up, and though adrenaline kept her sharp, it wouldn't last forever. But she could outthink them. Selene climbed to a higher vantage point, a broken scaffolding overlooking the square. From here she saw the confusion in their ranks. Leaders barked orders, trying to regain control. Half the unit remained near the firelight, while others spread out into the dark, blades drawn. She grinned. Darkness was her ally. She took the wire and stretched it between 2 shattered pillars along a tight corridor, a snare at ankle height. She then jammed a spike into the stone wall, tied the end of the wire to it, and reinforced the trap with shards of metal. Quick, simple, lethal. She moved again, always moving. Always one step ahead. She had killed 38 by her count. 12 remained. 12 men, 1 Selene. And they still thought they could outlast her. She leaned back against a broken column and let the silence return. Not a surrender, not a pause, a promise. The silence before the next surge. The rain had returned, falling in thin sheets over the stone and ash like the world itself was trying to wash away the violence. Selene didn't move. She lay low on the rooftop of a collapsed barracks building, motionless except for her shallow breathing. A single flicker of movement would give her away. She couldn't risk it. Not yet. Beneath her, the remaining soldiers moved like angry wasps. 12 men now, fanned out, tense and impatient. They hadn't expected her to last this long, certainly not through 5 hours of continuous battle. And yet here she was, still breathing. Still watching, still hunting. Her fingers brushed against her ribs. The fracture was worse now. Every breath scraped her lungs. A deep gash across her thigh pulsed with heat, and her left shoulder had started to seize. She had long passed the point of human endurance, but she hadn't broken. Not even close. There was a name for what came after the third wind, what fighters only whispered about in old war songs. It was the space beyond exhaustion, beyond pain, where the mind separates from the body and acts with deadly clarity.
They called it the fourth wind. Selene had reached it. Everything slowed, not in the literal sense, but in how she perceived the world around her. The clanking of armor, the squelch of boots in mud, the shouts echoing off stone. She catalogued each sound. She knew where every man was, and she knew who was next. One of them broke formation. He wandered too far from the others, muttering to himself, as if hoping his voice would drown the silence. He carried a torch, sloppy. He wanted light, but in this battlefield, it made him a beacon. Selene moved. She descended the crumbling building like a shadow. The rain masked her landing. Her footfalls were silent, even on wet stone. She stalked him for 7 seconds, long enough to hear him curse her name under his breath. And then he was dead. A slit throat. Quick, clean. She caught the torch before it hit the ground and snuffed it under her boot. 11. The soldier's body slumped, and the others took a moment too long to notice he'd gone silent. Selene melted into the alleyways again, her heartbeat calm. She no longer moved like someone trying to survive. She moved like someone in control. Her enemies didn't know it yet, but the balance had shifted. The hunt had begun. To the west of the plaza, Captain Darren was losing his patience. He'd seen elite squads scattered, men with decades of experience, gutted like fools, and all by one woman. He'd never believed in battlefield myths, but Selene was eroding that certainty by the second. She's bleeding. She has to be. No one takes this kind of damage and keeps going, he muttered, gripping his sword hilt. His second-in-command, Vorik, was less sure. She's not just fighting, Captain. She's thinking, planning. So we tighten the circle, push in slowly, smoke her out. Vorik didn't answer immediately. Then he said, "That's what the last team tried. We never found their bodies." The captain's jaw clenched. He knew they couldn't retreat. Not after the bounty on Selene's head. Not after the warlords paid triple to make her an example. But it no longer felt like a hunt. It felt like a funeral procession. And he didn't know whose it was. Selene watched the argument unfold from behind the skeletal remains of a war wagon. The 2 officers were lit by a fire barrel. Their soldiers surrounded them in a loose circle, forming a kind of temporary camp within the ruins. They were stalling, trying to regroup. She wouldn't let them. Selene took a breath, then moved through the narrow underpass that connected the rear of the camp to the collapsed granary. It was dark, no torches, no guards. She left 2 snares along the path, rigged with wire and oil pots. If anyone chased her that way, they'd regret it. At the granary she found exactly what she needed. Old sacks of flour, dry enough to still catch fire. She slit them open and began dragging the powder in a thin line around the outskirts of the soldiers' camp. Rain had slowed, but not stopped. She had to move fast. She worked in silence, marking her trail in a wide circle, then placing a final pile of soaked rags, drenched in alcohol, she'd scavenged earlier. By the time she lit the fuse, she was already gone. Flames erupted along the flour line like a serpent of fire coiling through the dark. Shouts exploded in the camp. Some tried to douse the flames. Others panicked and ran toward the alley, where her traps waited. 2 were caught in the snare. A third ran straight into a wire and fell screaming as metal tore through his legs. Selene struck a 4th from above, dropping from a ledge and driving her dagger into the base of his neck. She rolled as he fell, landing beside another soldier already pulling his sword. He swung. She parried, reversed her grip, and stabbed him through the ribs. He gurgled once and dropped. 9, 8, 7. Now they were isolated, scattered. Selene disappeared again, this time into the broken colonnades at the heart of the ruins. She wiped blood from her blade, and crouched behind a statue split in 2 by earlier fighting. She could hear their fear now. Barked orders, frantic questions. The firelight flickered behind them. Selene's expression remained unreadable. She had stopped running hours ago. Now they were the ones trying to escape. The fire crackled behind her like a heartbeat, rhythmic and relentless. Selene crouched in the shadow of a shattered statue, the goddess of justice, ironically, her back to the heat, her eyes scanning the perimeter. Flames from the flower trap she'd ignited, moments before still danced across the far end of the square, silhouetting her enemies as they stumbled in confusion and fear. 7 now, maybe 8. Hard to say exactly. Some had run when the fire erupted, and not all of them had screamed. Her breathing came in shallow bursts. Blood ran down her leg from the thigh, wound she'd tried to bind with cloth ripped from a fallen cloak. Every motion brought a flare of pain, but it didn't stop her, couldn't stop her. The fire stirred something deeper, a memory, not the hazy recollections she sometimes pulled for comfort. Her mother's laughter, the smell of fresh bread on market day. No, this one was carved into her soul. She had been 14, a child in name, but old enough to understand horror. The village of Mirren Vale had burned like this, not from battle, but from betrayal. Mercenaries, these same men, or their kind, had come under the banner of protection. They'd smiled as they ate her people's food, drank their wine. Then one morning, the bells had rung, not to wake the village, to warn it. Too late. Celine remembered the screams, the smoke choking the air, the heat blistering her skin. She remembered running barefoot over burning thatch, gripping a rusted spear twice her size. She remembered standing over her father's body, blade in hand, swearing that she would not die until every man responsible for that day had been sent to hell. Now here she was, nearly a decade later, facing the same kind of soldiers, wearing different colors but carrying the same cruelty in their eyes. And they thought she would surrender. She rose slowly, rotating her shoulder. It groaned in protest, but obeyed. The edges of her vision pulsed black with exhaustion, but her mind was sharp, clearer than it had been in hours. The fourth wind still carried her. Footsteps echoed to her left. Celine slipped into the rubble, moving from cover to cover like smoke. One of the remaining soldiers was approaching cautiously, peering into the firelit haze with his blade raised. She recognized him, Aaron, a heavy-set man with a scar across his lip. He had killed at least 2 civilians during a border raid last year. She remembered every face, every name, and she never forgot a killer. She waited until he passed by, then struck. No hesitation. Her blade punched through the gap beneath his shoulder guard, slipping between his ribs. He gasped, a wet sound, more surprise than pain. She caught him before he could fall loudly, and laid him gently against the stones. 6. She took his belt. He had throwing knives. Good steel. Balanced. She tested one, flipping it in her hand, then moved on. The remaining men were retreating now, unknowingly, bunching toward the ruins of the old inner temple at the plaza's center. Its spire had long since collapsed, leaving only broken archways and moss-covered columns, a graveyard of their own making. Celine tracked them from a distance, keeping her footsteps light, despite her injuries. The storm had passed, but the air was still damp, and every wet stone threatened to betray her position with a slip. She stopped near a crumbled staircase, crouching low, listening. Captain Darren's voice cut through the air. We regroup here. She's bleeding out. She can't last. We said that an hour ago, someone muttered. And now Aaron's gone. She's one woman, Darren snapped. Do you all believe in ghosts now? No one answered. Celine's lips curled. Let doubt fester. She scanned the perimeter. The temple ruins offered few exits. If they made a stand here, they'd be easy targets. But something about the captain's tone told her they weren't standing. They were planning something. Retreat? A trap? She couldn't wait to find out. She moved again, circling the rear of the temple. The space beyond it opened into what had once been the sacred garden, now overgrown and walled in by the city's remains. A perfect choke point. She could hear them setting something, dragging crates, knocking over broken benches, rustling through what was left of old supply barrels, trying to bait her. She'd take the bait, but on her terms. Celine scaled the side of the temple remains, using a collapsed beam as leverage. Her body screamed, her shoulder threatened to dislocate, but she hauled herself up until she crouched above the old altar chamber, hidden in shadow. Below she saw them, 5 of them now. 2 must have wandered off or collapsed from injuries. Captain Darren stood at the center, his sword planted into the stone. He looked older now, tired, blood-smeared, but determined. Good, he would fall last. Celine took a breath, centered herself, and dropped silently behind the nearest soldier. 2 swift cuts, one across the hamstrings, one through the throat. He fell twitching. Panic erupted. Another man turned, just in time to meet a thrown dagger to the chest. 4. She didn't give them time to regroup. She rolled left as a sword whistled past her ear, then elbowed the attacker in the jaw, and drove her boot into his chest. He stumbled back, and straight into a broken column. The crack of his skull against stone was final. 3. Darren roared and charged, swinging with rage. Celine ducked once, twice, then lunged forward, letting his sword scrape her side as she drove her shoulder into his gut. He went down hard, gasping. 2 soldiers remained, and they ran. She didn't chase, not yet. Celine turned toward the captain as he crawled backward, bleeding and disarmed. "You don't understand," he gasped. "They'll send more." "Let them," she said. Then she brought her sword down. "Up next you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell, so you don't miss any upload from us."